What's the most body-freezing confession you've heard? Story 1. At a teenage sleepover, my friend told me the leader of their church had been assaulting her repeatedly, and she was scared she might be pregnant. We had just been talking about Take That versus Backstreet Boys. We were 13. She had written about it in an essay we'd been assigned that same week, and our teacher had an absolute meltdown, but in the most helpful way. She made it clear that none of it was the girl's fault, called her parents in to help facilitate the conversation, meaning to make absolutely sure they believed their daughter and would do what was needed to support her, contacted the police, and got social services involved to get the girl into specialist care. Her parents drove home, and then E's father went for a little walk over to their formerly trusted family friend's house. I heard the authorities showed up, but nobody was arrested that evening. In rural Norway, things work like this. If you stop right now, I don't have to do paperwork. Don't make me come back. My stepfather mentioned seeing the preacher limping around on crutches, and my mom just said, good. There was a court case, and of course, many people from the church claimed the 13-year-old had seduced the adult and was just a troubled girl trying to ruin a good man. The judge didn't believe that for a second, and that good man ended up in prison, but my friend never really recovered. She tried so hard, went through inpatient treatment for the eating disorder and self-harm tendencies that developed from the trauma, and even now as an adult, you can see she's carrying something heavy with her. I love you, E. None of this was your fault. I'm so sorry someone so awful took so much from you. Story 2. A few years ago, my mom picked me up so we could get food on my birthday and randomly brought up something that happened years ago when she and I went to Disney for a cheerleading competition. The only thing I asked for on that whole trip, aside from food, was a round Minnie Mouse plushie filled with those soft, bead-like stuffing. It was super squishy and soft, so I brought it to my mom and asked if I could have it. She had said no, and I just assumed she didn't want me to have it. That day, she casually told me why I ended up getting it on the last day of the trip. At the time, she and my biological father were still married, and he had emptied their joint bank account at a local adult venue. Her friend, whose daughter was also on the team, had to cover dinner for us that night, and I had no idea. The next morning, my mom had to call her job and ask for a 3-day advance on her paycheck because we weren't leaving until Saturday morning. That meant nearly 4 days without food money since our package only included breakfast at the resort. I already disliked my biological dad at this point, and I just couldn't believe he would be so careless. I believed he could do it. I just didn't expect him to leave us without food for days. I still have that plushie, by the way. It's in my closet. My biological father? No contact. Story 3. My grandmother married a man nearly 20 years younger than her, shortly after my sister and I were born. When we were about 2 years old, our mother entered a psychiatric facility, and we were placed in our grandmother's care. About 4 or 5 months later, my sister developed what my grandmother thought was a UTI, but upon examination, it turned out to be something much worse. After a formal investigation, my grandmother's husband was arrested. Nearly 2 decades passed. Though my grandmother had divorced him, she remained friends with his 2 sisters, one of whom was about 15 years younger than him. During a 4th of July celebration, the sisters were visiting and mentioned that her ex had been released from prison and was living in a facility for offenders. That's when the older sister dropped a shocking comment. It didn't stop him last time, and it won't stop him this time. We all just stared at her in disbelief. What did she mean last time? Apparently, before marrying my grandmother, he had been released from a mental institution after being admitted for inappropriate behavior involving his youngest sister. The entire family knew about his history, but kept it to themselves because it happened when he was technically still a minor, 17, and they believed the hospitalization had fixed the issue. After he reoffended, they just never talked about it again, despite staying close with our family, which had been traumatized by what happened. Needless to say, we all cut off contact with them. Story 4. In high school, I went to a friend's house to hang out. This kid was a little sketchy, but I'd known him my whole life, and we were always good friends. When I got there, 2 guys were already there whom I had never seen before. They proceeded to tell us about the night before, when they helped their friend set his house on fire after he had committed a horrible act involving his grandparents. They told us how they smoked in the house with the bodies of his grandparents and his dogs. The person responsible had been on a 3-day drug bender, and his grandfather had tried to stop him from leaving the house. He then attacked his grandparents. The guy had videos on his phone of what he did. Gruesome, disturbing content. This happened in Oklahoma, if anyone's curious. The man's name was Kyle Smith, and he got life in prison plus 10 years. The two others who were there and helped burn the house were also arrested and spent some time in prison. Story 5. I have a family member with dementia. She can't remember names, but she recognizes faces and has difficulty communicating. I brought some old family photos to have something to talk about, thinking she'd enjoy seeing them. I showed her a photo of her uncle, and she immediately became clear and serious. She said he had hurt her sisters, and her older sister had once tried to get her to go over to his house so she wouldn't have to anymore. But she refused. They lived next door, and that refusal created a lifetime of bad blood between her and her sister. I always knew they didn't get along, but I never knew why. Hearing her recount this story so clearly, with full names and details, was shocking. I hadn't heard her so coherent in years. I knew Uncle D. We had gone over to his house countless times, and I had good memories of him. I couldn't tell if this was just a story created by her dementia or if it was real, given how vividly she recalled it. Story 6. I used to work nights at a hotel. One week I was scheduled for the later part of the week and missed that we had been housing a family friend of the general manager. This guest was an elderly woman, probably in her early 80s. She came down to the front desk at midnight looking for a bottle of water and ended up staying until around 3 a.m., just talking about life, telling stories, and I was listening and chatting since it was a quiet night. Then she shared why she was there. She had been deemed not mentally fit to be unsupervised and had tried to leave the state with friends against her husband's wishes. He was her designated supervisor. After she ran off, the police had to find her, so her kids arranged for her to stay at the hotel. She told me she hated her husband because of all the trauma he caused their son, including making him work a dangerous logging job where he was seriously injured in his early 20s. She went on and on. She also told me she was supposed to be taking her medications, but her kids hadn't brought them in 3 days. One of those medications was lithium, along with a few antipsychotics and other prescriptions. She said she was on them because she once tried to run over her husband and ended up being institutionalized for a short time. I made an excuse to go do something in the back to step away, and when she asked to switch rooms for a better view, I told her the morning manager would need to handle that. The next morning, while I was training a new breakfast worker, she had a full psychotic episode and appeared in the dining area wearing only a bath towel. That's a whole other story, but I felt it was necessary to include here. Story 7. 2 friends and I were on vacation in Amsterdam. We were sitting in a lounge at a coffee shop smoking when a guy came in. He was very chill, said he was from the UK and had moved to the Netherlands a while back. It was just the 4 of us in the lounge, having a casual conversation about motorcycles and similar stuff. Then my friend asked him why he moved to the Netherlands. As he answered, he slowly settled into a distant, haunted expression. He said that back in the UK, one night someone broke into his house while he was home. He got into a fight with the intruder and managed to knock him out. He tied the man up and called the police, but the police didn't come. He called multiple times, but after over an hour with no response, he dragged the intruder into the yard and poured gasoline over him. Then he called the police again, held the phone near the man, and started screaming, "Help me! He's going to kill me! He's going to burn me alive!" That time, the police showed up. They arrested both of them, and both were sent to prison. After serving his sentence, he moved to the Netherlands to start over. You could tell the story was real by the look on his face and the silence that followed. We all just sat there for a moment, completely quiet. He stared at the wall, not saying anything. Then he snapped out of it, and we resumed a more normal conversation. But I'm not gonna lie, we were all extremely nervous after hearing that story. Story 8. We were standing around at work, maybe 5 or 6 of us, all taking turns making jokes and telling stories. Our boss was also hanging out with us. One of the newer guys started telling a story with the vibe that we were all going to find it funny. Basically, he and his cousin went to a party hoping to meet some girls. They split up into couples. His cousin got rejected by the girl and left, upset, leaving him there. He woke up still drunk and saw that his cousin was gone. Apparently, he panicked, thinking something shady had happened. He pulled out a knife and demanded the girls' phones. He kept asking what they did with his cousin, thinking something bad had happened to him. He kept them there, demanding answers and scaring them. Eventually, his cousin called and said he had just left because the girl wasn't interested. So the guy returned their phones and waited in their apartment until his cousin came back to get him. Everyone just stared at him. Jaws dropped. My boss walked away halfway through the story so he wouldn't be part of the conversation. I told the guy, I would probably never tell that story again if I were you. I have a daughter, and I dread the thought of her going out for a normal night and encountering someone like that. He didn't seem to understand how terrifying that situation must have been for those girls. He thought it was just a funny misunderstanding. Story 9. There was this guy I hung out with once in a while for maybe 6 months before we eventually lost contact. My wife and I got along with him and his family fine, but we just didn't really click as friends. A few years later, he showed up wanting to talk to someone familiar. I've had rough times before, so I invited him in and asked how he'd been. He said he was stressed because his wife had an injury and told him to find someone else for companionship while she recovered. They were in an open relationship. He thought it was a good idea to text his 12-year-old stepdaughter and her 13-year-old friend. He told the story from his own perspective, and at the end, dropped one chilling line. I told her she couldn't buy a new movie, so she stole my phone and sent all those texts to herself and her friend to get back at me. Then he said he was taking a plea deal and going to prison for 5 years. We didn't say anything supportive, just let him leave. He's now on a registry for life, and even he didn't seem to believe the version of events he told. We ended up moving before he got out 5 years later. It wasn't the only reason, but it definitely started the maybe we shouldn't live here conversation. Story 10. One day out of nowhere, my dad told me about the last time he saw his father. Apparently, his dad had been an alcoholic who used to beat him, his brother, and their mom after drinking. One night, my dad and his brother had enough. They waited for him to come home, and when he walked in, my uncle threw a heavy raincoat over his head. Together, they started hitting him. My dad said he kept going for about 10 minutes, even after my uncle told him the man had gone limp. They dragged him into the street in the middle of the night and never saw him again. My dad told me this while we were out on an errand. Then he said, "You're about to meet your great uncle, my uncle, who I haven't seen or spoken to in decades. He knows what happened to your grandfather." We got to the house and had a brief catching up chat. My great uncle told my dad that his father had recently passed away in a hospital, alone, after battling cancer. Despite knowing how to reach my dad, he had never contacted him and offered no explanation. He just said their father had stayed an alcoholic. That was the most I'd ever learned about my family, and it was a lot to take in as an 11-year-old. Years later, I realized something strange. My dad lost both his father and brother under similar circumstances. They stopped speaking after violent conflicts, and both died from alcohol-related illness. Story 11. I used to work in a very rough warehouse, the kind of place that would hire anyone. One day we got a new guy. I'll call him Bill. He looked a little unusual, always had a wide-eyed look, but talking to him, he seemed intelligent and friendly. He always wore baggy jeans, and one day he lifted his pant leg to scratch an itch, and I saw he was wearing an ankle monitor. I was confused because I thought the company did background checks. Later, I found out the company worked with the prison system to hire people transitioning from halfway houses. Bill had served more than 10 years in prison. He never told anyone what he had done, was always secretive about it. Eventually, rumors started going around. People said he'd been in prison for hurting someone. Curiosity got the better of me, and I looked him up online. What I found out was that it wasn't an adult. It had involved a 16-year-old girl. I kept this to myself, but I couldn't look at him the same way after that. Then one day, Bill said something disturbing. He told me he was riding his bike to a store when he saw a woman and started to feel something he described as uncomfortable. He said it scared him, so he left quickly to avoid doing anything impulsive. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and said, "Oh, wow." Story 12. My grandfather was crying one day in the dining room. I asked him what was wrong, and he said nothing. He was just remembering the little Italian boy who saved his life. My grandfather was a paratrooper in the French Foreign Legion, 3RF. He was stationed in Algeria during the conflict and saw a lot of action there. This story was chilling. They were on patrol and my grandfather was the point man. He was relatively new. The Italian soldier came up beside him and told him to stop and survey the surroundings. The area was a prime location for an ambush. My grandfather said he was scanning the area when the Italian shouted, "Get down!" shoved him to the ground, and fired a burst directly to their right. Return fire came immediately, and the Italian dropped like dead weight. My grandfather's unit took cover and returned fire. He dragged the Italian to safety and started tending to his wounds while calling for the medic. The soldier had been hit in the abdomen and was bleeding badly. They patched him up, but the medic said he needed a hospital fast. The fight went on for a while, but eventually the firing slowed. It seemed the attackers had retreated. The unit leader called for a helicopter to evacuate the wounded. There was only one, the Italian. The helicopter arrived, and they loaded him up on a stretcher. But the attackers hadn't left. They had been waiting. They started shooting at the helicopter. The pilot tried to gain altitude quickly and banked to avoid the gunfire. My grandfather watched as the stretcher slid out and the Italian fell straight to the ground. He hit with a loud thud, dust rising on impact. He landed in the open so no one could get to him right away. The helicopter had to leave. This time my grandfather's unit didn't wait. They were angry and they pushed forward until they were completely sure the area was secure. When it was finally clear, my grandfather ran to the Italian who had passed away from the fall. My grandfather saw a lot during his service, but this was the memory that haunted him the most. A man died saving his life. He blamed himself for the loss and said the amount of blood he saw that day stayed with him forever. Even a small cut made him sick. It was also the first time he said he took a life out of pure anger. This was the only story he ever shared about Algeria. He said it was the worst day of his life. Story 13. I was 16, out at a bonfire party with some new friends I'd met on a short course. We were drinking cider and playing Never Have I Ever. One guy said, "Never have I ever killed someone," and then drank. We were all stunned and someone nervously asked what happened. He told us that back home he had been part of a gang, and that was his initiation task. He didn't threaten us, but the implication was clear. We weren't supposed to tell anyone. He was from a different country and his name was very common, so we couldn't really do anything with the information. Another unsettling moment happened on a road trip with my parents when I was also 16. We were heading to a village in the mountains when my dad picked up a hitchhiker. My dad liked meeting people and wasn't a small guy, so safety didn't usually concern him. But almost immediately, something about the man felt off. We told him where we were going, and he said he was a police officer investigating crimes in that area. Then he turned to me with a wide grin and said I needed to be careful going up there, or I might really need to earn my way. I froze, laughed it off, and we dropped him off quickly, never mentioning it again. But that moment has stuck with me for over 10 years. Story 14. I have one scary story and one fun one. Starting with the scary one. I used to work at a restaurant with a guy I became close friends with. We would often hang out, go drinking, and stay up late. He told me a lot about his difficult childhood, being physically abused by his father and bullied in school because of a slight lisp. One night after a late shift and a lot of drinking, we were walking back to his place to smoke and play video games. That's when he casually told me that he used to hurt animals when he was younger. He said he did it in various ways, setting one on fire, tying another to a rock, and throwing it into a pond. The worst part was when he described harming one in detail, including how long it took and how it behaved. He even chuckled while telling it. It was disturbing. The second story is much lighter. My wife's grandmother was a very eccentric woman who lived in a massive house with no furniture, just a mattress on the floor. She spent all her time on her art, which filled every wall. She lived in Alabama after World War II. She had served in the Women Air Force Service Pilots, WASP, and while she didn't fly, she monitored radar systems. Over dinner one evening, she casually told us she had been sworn to secrecy, but was tasked with tracking unusual aerial activity over the Gulf of Mexico. She said she personally tracked 12 incidents, though she knew her team tracked many more. Story 15. One time my grandma casually told me about when my mom wanted to hurt my grandfather. We were just doing the dishes when she said she was actually glad her ex-husband had passed away and was tired of pretending to be sad about it. She started talking about how he had been a heavy drinker and had abused both her and my mom. That part I already knew. I'd overheard people talking about it for years. Then she told me about a specific night when he came home drunk, started dragging her around the room while my mom cried. He threw something, shattered a window, then took some hidden money and started to leave. At that point, my mom allegedly grabbed a piece of broken glass and started running at him, screaming that she was going to hurt him. My grandma said she had to hold her back until she calmed down. After telling me all of this, my grandma just moved on and started talking about the good old days and how things used to be better, while I stood there having an existential crisis. I used to love my grandfather as a little boy. I thought he was such a nice man. That conversation completely changed how I saw him. Story 16. I had a friend, let's call him Bill, back in my youth who used to sell. Around 13 years old, we were hanging out one day when he stopped to make a deal. The deal went bad. They stole the product and took off running. We ended up chasing them and cornered them into their house. They came out with knives, so we left. Bill was furious and talked about revenge, but he eventually calmed down, and I didn't hear anything else about it. Fast forward about 7 years, I ran into Bill. now more of an acquaintance, at a party. We talked and caught up. At the end of the night, I offered to drive him home since I was the only sober one. He and a couple of the guys I came with were in the car, reminiscing about the old days. Bill, a bit drunk, changed tone and said, "Hey man, remember those guys who stole from me back in the day and we chased them?" I said, "Yeah, I remembered, but hadn't thought about it in years. I didn't even remember their names." Then Bill said something I'll never forget. "Well, I never told you this at the time, but I had them taken care of. I've never felt so uncomfortable in my life. I wish he had never told me." Part of me thinks he was exaggerating. He used to have gang connections, but he also had a habit of stretching the truth to make stories sound better. Still, something about how he said it felt like he wasn't joking. Story 17. My grandparents once casually dropped a story about nearly giving my dad up for adoption. My dad definitely had no idea, and he was shocked when I told him. After a while, he reflected on it and said some parts of his life started to make more sense. The story isn't as bad as it sounds. For context, my grandparents were non-Jewish German citizens from upper-middle-class families during World War II. No one in the family was directly involved in the war effort, and they were both too young to be part of the youth movement, probably about 10 years old. They met after the war, got married, and had 2 kids. My dad was the third. My grandmother's sister couldn't have children and asked to adopt my dad. It almost happened, but my grandma backed out at the last minute because she just couldn't go through with it. They kept my dad and later immigrated to the U.S. legally. My grandparents eventually had 6 boys total. After hearing this, my dad realized how differently his aunt treated him growing up. For birthdays, he always got extra special gifts. She gave him more attention and showed more affection than she did to his brothers. He now believes it was because he was nearly her son. It was funny to him, but also pretty mind-blowing. This came up randomly on a weekend trip when I happened to visit my grandparents. Grandpa had a few cold beers and apparently decided it was story time. He also shared a few other major family stories that day. I guess they were getting older and wanted to open up. My grandpa was about 88 then. He passed away 2 years later at 93. My wife and I still look back on that day and all the things we learned. People who lived through World War II really do have some unbelievable stories. Story 18. I always tell this story simply, but here's what happened. I was around 11 years old sitting in the car when a radio segment came on about abortion, something about pro-choice versus pro-life. I told my mom I could never have an abortion. I believed all life was valuable. At this point, I had already been through a lot with her: abuse, emergency removal by CPS, homelessness, and more. Not much left me speechless anymore, but she just looked ahead blankly and said, "I was going to have an abortion with you. I wanted to." I turned to look at her, and she just sat there. Then she continued. Maybe I asked her something, I'm not sure, but she told me this. My biological dad, who she met in recovery, denied me and she moved back home, states away. She got back together with a very abusive ex and planned to terminate the pregnancy. She had already done so once before, which also shocked me. She said the man was hurting her every day, trying to cause a miscarriage. He pushed her downstairs, hit her stomach, and more. Then one night while she was alone, she said something spoke to her. She believes it was God. She said it told her she had to have this baby, that I was created for a reason. From then on, she knew she couldn't go through with it. She stopped using and moved back up north to reconnect with my biological dad. That's when I came into the picture, along with my stepdad. That was the day I became pro-choice. My mom could have spared me from so much pain and chose not to. I didn't say anything for a long time, and it made me feel awful in ways I didn't understand yet. My mom had a terrible life. Everything she did to me and my brother, her parents had done to her even worse. She didn't talk much about her past before foster care. I feel for her. She gave me the same start she was given, but I've been lucky to have more choices. Still, it's a lot to hear when you're only 11 years old. Story 19. My ex-boyfriend used to randomly tell me really dark things with little to no warning when we were together. It was a toxic and abusive relationship, which is why those things were said and why I stayed. I was very concerned for him, but he also scared me quite a lot. For example, he told me he had hit or kicked his dog, and he kicked me a couple of times, even in front of other people. He said he had dacrophilia, a condition where someone is aroused by tears, and would get angry if I asked if it applied to me. I always suspected it did, but he insisted it only applied when people he disliked cried. He once told me, completely unprompted, that he had seen a violent video online and it affected him in a very disturbing way. He constantly told me about dark and unsettling dreams and would talk about fantasizing about hurting or killing people. I once told him, near the end of our relationship, that if he ever acted on it, I believed I would be the victim. He just casually said, no. It wasn't a convincing response. He claimed to have people or things in his mind that had been there since he was young. They had names, different personalities, and he would draw them. According to him, some of them liked me and some didn't. One of them was female, and I apparently looked a lot like her. I could go on, but this is honestly the most I've ever said publicly about it. It's exposing and scary. To anyone out there trapped in a relationship with someone who scares, hurts, or disrespects them, I know what you're going through. Story 20. I was afraid of flying as a teenager, so my parents let me take a bus from San Francisco to Salt Lake City to visit my grandparents. The bus left late, and we passed through Nevada in the early morning, hitting a bunch of small casino towns just as the sun rose. It was a surreal and strangely beautiful experience. At one of the stops, an older hippie-looking man got on and sat near me with two teens, trying hard to act tough. They started talking, and surprisingly, all had stories about prison. The teens were in for minor offenses, but the older guy said he had served real time for beating someone into a coma. He told the story with this detached, dismissive tone, like getting locked up was just bad luck rather than the result of his own actions. The teens eventually went quiet. It became clear this guy was on a whole different level than they were. Then he said his sentence had been extended because the man he assaulted passed away from the injuries while he was still serving time. The way he talked about it, it almost sounded like he believed the victim had done it just to spite him. The whole thing had this odd, look at my bad luck energy. After that, the bus ride got really quiet. Story 21. I spent a year of my training as a clinical psychologist in a forensic psychiatric hospital, the kind of facility where people go after pleading not guilty by reason of insanity or being declared unfit to stand trial. One of my responsibilities was to sit down one-on-one with patients and assess their understanding of the crimes they were charged with. I'd spend about an hour interviewing them about what happened, their mindset at the time, and their current perspective. Then I'd write a report that would be reviewed by the team and used to refine the patient's treatment plan. I did this with individuals charged with serious offenses, assault, abuse, murder, and even cannibalism. Over the course of a year, I conducted about 50 of these interviews. So, as you can imagine, I heard some very heavy confessions. I haven't read through other people's stories yet, but I'm pretty sure not many can say they've heard someone confess to eating someone they once loved. Story 22. Not exactly a confession, but it was extremely jarring and came up completely out of the blue. At my first professional job, I had a coworker I'll call Jane. She was a small, quiet woman in her late 30s, though maybe older. Her hair was already graying a bit. She reminded me of Velma from the old Scooby-Doo shows I watched as a kid, just with much longer hair. Jane and I rarely spoke, only during brief interactions at the copy machine. We'd exchange greetings and go about our day. One day we were at the copier at the same time and did our usual hello. Then she slowly started venting about how stressful her week had been. It was a one-sided conversation, but she was talking to me, so I nodded along. She began with the usual stuff, deadlines, kids acting up. But then, in the same calm tone, she said that the night before, she had been in the car with her husband when they started arguing. He suddenly drove off the road into the woods, pulled a handgun from the glove box and held it to her head. She said he alternated between ranting about how tired he was of her and asking if arguing with him was worth her life. At one point, he even wondered aloud how well their kids would cope with him in prison and her gone. Then without another word, he put the gun away, drove back to the road, and they went on with their evening. I was completely frozen. I was only 26 and had no idea how to respond. She didn't wait for one either. She just walked off like it was nothing. Looking back, I think she just needed to process what had happened and use me as a sounding board. But it haunted me for a while. I hadn't thought about it in years until this question brought it all back. Story 23. I have many stories. When I was very young, maybe 7 years old, my mom opened up to me about some of her past traumas. It was like something others here have mentioned, where it just came out randomly, as if she needed to tell someone. I was way too young to hear these things, but it did help me understand her better. We don't get along very well. She first told me that when she was around 4 years old, her dad took her kitten outside and killed it in front of her. Another time, she told me about something awful that happened to her as a teenager. A boy she didn't know pulled up in a convertible and asked her to go for a ride. She agreed, but once they started driving, he took out a bag of silver paint and began inhaling it. She said that by the time he pulled over, the paint was all over his face. He got out of the car and something terrible happened. She never reported it. Another time I asked why she had divorced my dad, as little kids do, and she told me it was because he had a drinking problem. He would stay out all night and then come home and leave our front door wide open. On one occasion, they argued while he was holding baby me, and he pushed her while still holding me. I luckily don't remember that, though I have memories from that time. She also told me that when she was young, her brother touched her inappropriately. The same man, my uncle, touched me once during a family Christmas. I didn't tell anyone until much later. It wasn't until I was in my 20s that I learned my dad also had a drug problem. He used Hero and would come home with needles in his shirt pockets. I was told he accidentally burned down his parents' house while high. One of the most unbelievable stories is about my great-grandparents. My family has owned farmland for generations. Apparently, some of our relatives were even buried on it. My great-grandparents were once having an argument, and at one point, my great-grandfather dug up the skull of his wife's sister, who was buried on the property, and showed it to her just to upset her. After hearing all these stories, a lot about my family started to make sense. I've had a very difficult time with my parents, especially. Honestly, I could go on and on about my whole family. Story 24. My summer camp used to bring in underprivileged girls, and I still remember two of them in the stories they shared. One girl's mother had been an S worker who was murdered, possibly by Robert Pickton. She was then placed in foster care with an abusive caregiver who once tried to smother her with a pillow. One day at camp, a counselor entered our cabin wearing a mask, and this girl had a complete meltdown. Later, she told us she had been assaulted by a group of men who wore masks. The second girl is someone I still think about a lot. She was in her early teens and had been dating her best friend's older brother. He wanted to be intimate, but she wasn't ready. One day, he took her to a construction site and hit her with a piece of wood, knocking her unconscious. She woke up in pain and told her mother, who took her to the doctor. The boy was sent to a detention center. She remained friends with the boy's little sister, and they had a sleepover later on. She recalled the dad making them soda drinks while they watched VHS tapes. The next morning, they couldn't remember anything past a certain point. When they went to finish watching the movie, they discovered the tape had been recorded over, with deeply disturbing footage involving the father. It was apparently his way of retaliating for what happened to his son. That girl ended up in the foster care system. About 10 years later, I saw her working on the streets downtown. I think about her often and feel such sadness, wondering where she is now. Story 25. I was raised in a Christian conservative home where being open about same-sex attraction meant being disowned. My parents used words like disgusting, sinful, shameful, and abomination to describe anyone who identified as LGBTQ+, whether it was someone they saw on TV or someone we knew. This was extremely difficult for me as a bisexual woman. I kept that part of myself hidden for so long, so hidden that I didn't even fully accept it until I was married. My husband, who I love deeply, is also a Christian, but not the kind my parents are. He pointed it out gently and continued to love and support me. Then one day my mom randomly confessed something that floored me. She said she doesn't find men physically attractive. They do nothing for me, she said. Then completely casually she added, but boobs, and snapped her fingers. Those get me every time. I said nothing, because my mom could never handle the full reality of what she just admitted. She's been married to my dad for 37 years, never desiring intimacy, and only ever being attracted to women. She doesn't realize she's a closeted lesbian, but I've kept that confession in the back of my mind, just in case there's ever a time where she needs someone to help her see it for herself. Story 26. Back in 2015, when I was 20, I went to the bank on a Saturday morning. This branch only had the drive-thru open on Saturdays. There was an older woman standing in the drive-thru area between my car and another. She approached me and asked if she could sit in my car because the tellers wouldn't help her unless she was in a vehicle. Being naive, I said sure. We chatted about small things like the weather and local events until she suddenly said something that creeped me out more than anything I've heard in person. She told me that her husband had passed away a few years ago and that she kept his body in her living room. Not ashes, not an urn, his actual body. She said she liked looking at him and would change his clothes regularly. I have no idea if that's legal. It probably isn't. I didn't ask how he died or whether she had anything to do with it. I didn't want to know. I just wanted her out of my car without making a scene. Thankfully, the car in front of me moved, and it was our turn. Once she completed her transaction, she got out of my car and left. I was too shocked and unsure to say anything to the teller. I've never let a stranger into my car again, no matter how harmless or kind they might appear. Story 27. When I was about 11, my family went out to the desert to test some guns that my uncle and grandpa had bought. My grandpa had been a firearms instructor for 40 years, so everything was always handled safely. After about an hour out in the sun, my cousin and I got bored and started playing in the back of my grandpa's truck. It had a bed cover, so it was shaded and cool. By play, I mean we snooped around in old boxes we probably shouldn't have. We were looking at random trinkets and digging through stuff when we found a very old wooden box at the bottom of a black trash bag. Inside was an old, broken dog collar. We didn't think much of it and left the box out. A few minutes later, our grandpa came back and saw what we'd found. He asked if he had ever told us why he became a firearms instructor. We said no. The story he told us has stayed with me ever since. When he was 16, he and his uncle went to the Tonto National Forest during hunting season. He wasn't a good shot then, and mostly went to get out of the house. They stayed out later than they should have and ended up lost near a stream at dusk. As they tried to find their truck, their hunting dogs became uneasy, completely still, tails between their legs, refusing to move. His uncle grew concerned because the dogs had never behaved like that before. Then they heard something moving across the stream, followed by the sound of a woman calling out, "Here, boy," and patting her legs. One of the anxious dogs started crossing the stream toward the voice. The area was pitch black, and the voice came from up a steep hill across the stream. The dog climbed up the hill following the voice. His uncle yelled out, telling the woman to stop scaring the dogs, but she didn't respond. He fired a warning shot into the air and threatened to take further action. My grandpa, from his angle, could see the hilltop clearly in the moonlight. He said there was a woman standing by a tree. When the dog reached her, she grabbed its collar and with one hand slammed it against the tree. He said the first hit paralyzed the dog, the second killed it, and the third broke it free from the collar. The dog rolled down the hill into the stream. My grandpa raised his rifle and fired at the figure until he couldn't see her anymore. Something fell into the water, what looked like the collar. He and his uncle carried the dog and the collar until they found their truck and drove away. He's never hunted in the Tonto National Forest since. After hearing that story, my cousin and I never dug around in any old boxes again. I later asked my mom about it, and she confirmed that Grandpa tells this story to everyone in the family at least once. It's the only scary story he's ever shared. Story 28. An uncle of mine in the 1960s, when he was just a kid, basically helped smuggle firearms. This was in the 1960s in Ireland, during a very tense time. He didn't know what he was doing back then. He used to collect parcels at the port for an older man in town and deliver them by bike for a bit of pocket money. He did this once or twice a week and was pretty proud of himself. One day, he was riding his bike to deliver a parcel when he fell off and one of the boxes tore open slightly. He looked inside and to him, it just looked like a bunch of metal, wood, springs, and screws. He thought nothing of it and continued on with the delivery. After that, he was never asked to collect any more parcels. He suspects the man didn't trust him anymore after that accident. About a decade later, he vaguely remembered the whole thing and brought it up to my Nana, who eventually told him the man had vanished after authorities found a shed of his filled with rifles. He was suspected of having connections to the IRA. When I was younger, my uncle loved telling this story. Anytime we had a family get-together and drinks were flowing, we'd hear it again. He's been more reluctant to talk about it lately, and honestly, I wish I had asked him more about it back when he was still willing to share. Story 29. My grandfather once told me how he had let his romantic rival drown so that my grandmother would only have him as a suitor. It wasn't told like a confession. It was more of a brag. In fact, it's apparently a well-known story in our family. According to my grandfather, he saw the other man slip on a muddy riverbank and grab onto a fallen tree branch sticking out of the water. My grandfather said he could have easily grabbed the end of the branch and pulled the man to safety, but instead, he just stood there and watched until the guy lost his grip and was swept away by the current. The scariest part of this story is that it was verifiably true. When I was a teenager visiting the town where it happened, I went to the local library to check old newspaper archives. They had a full set of microfiche, and I actually found the article. My grandfather was quoted in it, saying, "There wasn't anything anyone could do other than watch." Story 30. My mom almost didn't exist. My grandfather served in World War II in a vehicle he called a half-track. He was always a quiet man. I can remember him saying maybe 2 or 3 full sentences to us on any visit. We used to joke that Grandma talked enough for both of them. When Grandma had a heart attack and stroke and ended up in the hospital, my sister and I went down to help clean out the house and get them ready for assisted living. He wasn't happy about it, but we were doing what needed to be done. While we were there, Grandma had another episode and was rushed back to the hospital. We took Grandpa to see her, but due to COVID restrictions, which were easing at the time, the hospital wouldn't let him in until she was settled in a room. He refused to leave without seeing her, so we waited with him in the car. I'll never forget those hours in the car. I was afraid to even breathe, afraid he might stop talking. He shared more with us that night than he ever had in our whole lives. He talked about serving in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He talked about helping design war games for the military. Then he told us about Germany. His half-track had been hit, and he was left injured in a village bakery until medics could retrieve him. Our family name was clearly visible on his uniform, and it's a traditionally Jewish name. The villagers saw it and began beating him. He said he felt himself slipping away and began praying in Latin, the Lord's Prayer. He's a devout Catholic and knew it well. Someone heard him praying and asked in broken English, "Are you Catholic?" He whispered yes and nodded. They immediately stopped and left him alone. He lay there until Allied forces arrived and rescued him. I remember looking at my sister and thinking, we should be recording this. It was the most he had ever said in one sitting. He went on to tell us about his sweetheart, our grandma, and how much he loved her. He's been declining quickly in recent years. He only gets up to visit her, even though she mostly sleeps and rarely remembers who we are. He's compiled binders filled with his writing and research on our family history and his life. He gave them to me and told me he wants me to write his story one day. I promised I would. I hope I can do him justice. Tell the story of how much he loved his wife and served the country he adopted as a first-generation immigrant. Story 31. When I was in the Army, we had an NCO who was the kindest person you could ever meet. He never cursed, never yelled, and was like the friendly dad next door. A real Mr. Rogers type, but in camo, carrying a Bowie knife. We reached the part of our training where you're conditioned to take a life under certain circumstances. He used the book Black Hearts as an example. He talked about the murders, assaults, and the cruelty that took place, and warned us how easy it is to lose your soul in war if you're not careful. I remember his eyes going distant and his face going blank for a moment. Then he snapped right back to his usual self. A few weeks later, he casually mentioned having served in the unit the book was about, around the time of those events. But he never confirmed or denied being present for anything that had happened. After that, I couldn't help but get chills anytime he was around. Either he had memorized those exact passages in the book, or he had lived through things that weren't printed there. It was like looking into the eyes of someone who had seen the worst of humanity, but somehow still carried empathy. Story 32. I'm from a small town, but during 1 year of middle school and 2 years of high school, I went to an even smaller school one town over. My parents thought it would mean fewer bad influences. My first year there was rough. I didn't know anyone. Early on, I became friends with a somewhat popular kid, the only other person who wore metal band t-shirts and JNCOs instead of Wranglers. About 6 weeks into 8th grade, I started going out with a popular girl who was best friends with his longtime girlfriend. The four of us went to see Forrest Gump together. During the scene where Jenny and Forrest are hiding from her drunk father, my buddy got visibly uncomfortable. He and his girlfriend got up and left, making an excuse about bumming a cigarette. The girl I was with started explaining that my buddy's parents had split 2 years earlier, and his little sister had gone with their mom. While with her, something awful had happened involving her mom's new partner. It was reported, he was arrested, and the mom returned home with the sister. Weeks later, I was staying over at his house, something we did often since his dad worked nights and we could play loud music, sneak cigarettes, and goof off. He was looking for his jacket, thought his sister took it, and somehow the subject came up. I asked him if his mom had gone back to that guy since word around school was that she had left again. He just said, "No, she's not with anyone." The next day we were riding his four-wheeler along the fence line of his dad's property, part of his chores. He started pointing out places where he had buried coyotes he'd shot, which is fairly common out there. There by that tree, by that big rock. Then completely matter-of-fact, without slowing the four-wheeler, he pointed at another spot and said, "That's where my mom's buried." And he just kept driving. Story 33. You need a little context. I'm adopted. My biological grandmother and her husband, who isn't biologically related to me, adopted me and raised me to believe my biological mom was my half-sister. I found out about the adoption by accident when I was 20. My mom needed to fill out some paperwork that listed everyone she had ever lived with. There was my name, but with a different surname, and a man I had never heard of. After that, my dad became more open about the whole situation. One day we were riding in the car. My mom had been especially abusive that day, and we were both pretty fed up. He turned to me and said he wished he had left her before they found out about my birth. He had been considering leaving and staying single, but then I was born. When they discovered the neglect I was facing, they realized the only way to adopt me was to get married. And he told me he had hated every minute of his life since then. It's a strange kind of emotional whiplash to hear your dad say his life has been miserable and that you're the reason he stayed. Especially when I remember as a child begging them to divorce, begging them to be happy, even if it meant being apart. I always thought that would be better. I never imagined my dad would blame me for the relationship. Story 34. I have so many. When I was 13, I was in a mental hospital, and I met a girl who shared something that still sticks with me. She told me that when she was about 9 years old, she had been home with her dad when he ended his life with a firearm. She didn't know what the noise was and went to check. She found him and immediately called 911. Then she tried to hold his head together and put his brains back in. She didn't share this during group therapy, but during a casual activity, which made it even more shocking. Most girls save that kind of story for group or one-on-one conversations. During that same hospital stay, there was a little girl, maybe 6 years old, on our ward. She was there because she had tried to set fire to her house, reportedly because she didn't want to play house with her cousin anymore. There were other signs of abuse too. She didn't seem to understand why she was there, but followed along with everything and was like the little sister of the ward. She was so sweet. I also met a girl who had been a trafficking victim. One day she told us she used to be a recruiter. She would walk around her neighborhood, schools, and malls, approaching girls her trafficker pointed out. She told the story very casually, but you could see how deeply conflicted she felt about it. She truly didn't understand at the time that what she was doing was wrong or abnormal. There were also 2 other girls I met who had been trafficked. They had escaped from a sister facility of ours, but ended up returning to the people they had been trying to get away from. It was heartbreaking. Story 35. There was a guy in our high school friend group who always had people over at his house, whether it was after school or for weekend parties. His parents were pretty relaxed and let us do almost anything. Some people were truly friends with him, but for most of us it was just a place to hang out without rules. I didn't mind him. We were sort of friends, but he was a little odd. Not creepy, exactly, but awkward enough that being alone with him before others showed up could be uncomfortable. Some of us even warned girls to make sure others were there before visiting, not because we thought he'd do anything, but because he had a habit of scaring people off unintentionally. Anyway, one night, me, my girlfriend, and this guy were driving home from a party at a friend's place. Out of nowhere, he started talking about how he and another one of our guy friends had been drinking, and when the girls they invited didn't show up, they hooked up with each other. We thought he was joking and laughed it off, making jokes with him until he started crying. He got emotional, even grabbed my shoulder while I was driving, sobbing and saying how much he hated himself for it. For the rest of the drive, only about 10 minutes, we tried to comfort him, saying it was okay, things happen, and that we wouldn't tell anyone. I told him that if he needed to talk about it again, I'd be there. It was completely out of the blue. We'd been having such a great night, laughing the whole way home, and then he dropped that on us. It was one of the most unexpected things I've ever experienced. Story 36. I worked with a guy who had emigrated from South Africa. I honestly forget exactly which part. We used to ask him all the time about the differences between the US and where he grew up. He always made it sound like a nice place, until I asked why they moved here, especially to a pretty dangerous city. He said that he, his mom, and his sister came to the US because the worst that happens here is you forget to lock your door and someone steals your stuff. I pressed a little further, and he opened up more. Back where he grew up, they lived in a decent house, which was heavily fortified, and they even had armed guards. But that still didn't stop something terrible from happening. His mother and sister, who was around 12 at the time, were assaulted, and his father and brother were killed. He mentioned that over the course of 5 years, they had hired around 10 different guards. Some of them left for better-paying jobs, but others died while protecting the home. Despite how horrifying this was, he told the story in a strangely cheerful way. He even joked about how, after moving here, someone stole his mom's car, but no one was hurt, And that was a huge improvement in his eyes. That was 15 years ago. Since then, his family has moved to a much safer area. He and his sister are both married now, with kids, and are living the dream. Story 37. When I was a teenager, I used to buy from a guy down the street. He was in his mid-30s, a convicted felon, and had been in and out of jail or prison most of his life. One day I was hanging out at his trailer when he told me a story I'll never forget. He said that when he was a teenager, he was just at home one day when two older guys he knew grabbed him, threw him into a car, and drove him to a trailer. When they got inside, there was a body on the floor, blood everywhere, with fragments of bone and other things on the walls and floor. The two men had beaten someone to death with wooden sticks, and then brought him in and told him that if he didn't clean it up, they'd do the same to him. He started describing in disturbing detail how he cleaned up the scene. I knew he'd done a few multi-year stints in prison, but I never really knew for what. He had once mentioned robbery. Later, someone else told me that one of his prison sentences, 7 years, was related to a body found in a barrel at a local quarry. I'm pretty sure the body in the barrel was the same one he was told to clean up in that trailer. Story 38. I was friends for a few months with a guy who, I eventually learned, had some deeply troubling issues. I noticed early on that he had a drinking problem. He would physically shake if he went too long without a drink. And he had a poor me mindset. Everything was always someone else's fault. He claimed to have PTSD, so I tried to be understanding. Then one night, while he was heavily intoxicated, he became aggressive. He tried to assault me in his apartment. During the struggle, he admitted something that explained everything. He said that when he was 18, he hurt his younger sister, who was only 9 at the time. He claimed he was just experimenting and didn't know what to do with himself. He said that was why his family had cut him off. None of them had spoken to him in 11 years. Only his grandmother had stayed in touch, and she had recently passed. Suddenly, everything about him made sense. He had survived a serious accident with less than a 10% chance of making it. He was in the hospital for 4 months, and I visited him every day, even while I was dealing with organ failure myself. The hospital staff eventually made me his emergency contact because no one else ever showed up, not even his parents. At the time, I kept wondering, how bad could it be that not even his mother would come see him when he might die? After that night, I cut off all contact. The moment he laid hands on me and tried to force himself on me was already reason enough. But when he confessed what he had done to his sister, everything just clicked. It was like the final puzzle piece falling into place. That moment haunts me to this day. Story 39. Unfortunately, I'm usually the one casually throwing out horror stories like they're nothing. I survived a very, very difficult childhood, and even though I'm doing much better now, there's still a lot I carry. I went from severe depression, BPD, OCD, panic attacks, severe anxiety, suicidal ideation, severe insomnia, and PTSD, down to more manageable PTSD, occasional insomnia, and anxiety. The insomnia isn't constant anymore, and the PTSD mostly flares up when my birthday is near. I've been working hard on the anxiety, and honestly, I don't even think I'd qualify for BPD anymore. I barely show any symptoms. I also have ADH, and I've read that neurodivergence combined with trauma can sometimes be confused with BPD. Not totally sure. I feel well enough now to return to university. I'm married, and living a quiet, simple life makes me genuinely happy. All of this to say, because so many terrible things happened to me as a child and teenager, moderate trauma or family drama often feels kind of like a joke to me. Recently, I was talking to a social worker in a youth program meant to help people with jobs and training. I think she asked me about my parents, and I casually mentioned, laughing a bit, that my birth father, who I cut off years ago, was best friends for decades with his sister's abusive ex. Then I mentioned that my mother had me as an emotional replacement for her own mother, who took her own life. So even though we talk, our relationship has always been rocky. She just looked at me, kind of stunned, and I realized that this is a lot for most people to process. I thought, oh, right, that's not normal. And I had this moment of clarity where I understood that most people haven't survived the kind of abuse I have. Story 40. I was on a tour in Japan that ended up just being me, my husband, and our guide. No one else had booked. It was a lovely walking tour of Itsukushima, off the coast near Hiroshima, where we were staying. We got to see the deer, the shrines, and the beautiful nature. During lunch, we were chatting, and our tour guide started talking about his family. We talked about his kids, and then he casually mentioned that his grandmother had died in the atomic blast, and that his mother, who was 4 at the time, had survived because she was staying at a friend's house farther out. She didn't suffer long-term complications, which was lucky. He went on to say that when he was younger, his first girlfriend's parents refused to let her marry him after they found out he was a second-generation survivor of the bombing. It was something he had to keep secret for most of his life, and even now he couldn't talk about it openly. He also mentioned that he grew up feeling very anti-American, understandably, until he learned more about post-war history and how democratic systems were brought to Japan. Then our food came, and the conversation switched to clam farming and sashimi. I didn't want to pry further, but I had so many questions. I know it's not unusual for people in that region to have been affected by the bomb, but it was the way he spoke about it, calm, like it was just another part of life, that hit me hard. He seemed happy, though, and said that he learned English specifically so he could become a tour guide. I really admired that. Still, it was a surreal moment. He just casually said his grandmother was vaporized in the blast. It was wild. Story 41. So, my grandpa comes from a family of construction contractors. From a young age, he was basically forced to do exhausting labor for his older brothers. He was barely paid, if at all, was beaten and shamed if he didn't work fast or well enough, and was treated like disposable labor by his own family. These days, he owns his own contracting company where it's mostly just him, and last year, I went to stay with him and my grandma for a month or so. While I was there, I helped him with his construction work. Nothing too intense, mostly just painting walls and tearing down siding. During that time, he opened up and told me all sorts of stories from his past, mostly about the many ways he had been mistreated and exploited. He told them all in a joking tone, which felt totally at odds with how dark the stories actually were. A pretty common theme I've learned with people who've gone through that kind of thing. There were a few stories that were really hard to hear, but the one that stuck with me the most was when he told me that, at 13, his brothers forced him into an encounter that was supposed to make him a man. This was rural Quebec a long time ago, where there were no real social or legal consequences for the people involved. He told me this as just a throwaway anecdote in the middle of a conversation, and all I could do was nod and say, wow.